In school, we're taught that if we want to remember more, we should study more. But it turns out the Japanese have been doing something different for decades. After interviewing dozens of them and scouring academic research, here's what they do differently to remember everything. But the truth is that they try to minimize the time spent studying. They're filled with colorful highlighters, cute stickers, drawings, diagrams, and mind maps. In fact, most of them have really calm and clean study spaces. This technique is called Pomodoro. During these 5 minutes, they don't do anything study-related. Instead, they might stretch, walk around, grab a snack, or use the bathroom. This technique is also known as the teach-back method, where you explain what you've learned to someone else. Instead, they try to build small mindful habits that they do every day. But the truth is that everything you learn in school is useful in life. They know that if their bodies aren't healthy, their minds won't be either. So they try to get a good night's sleep every day. They eat balanced meals full of vitamins and minerals, and they get regular exercise. You might not realize it now, but you will later. Japanese students know this. They know that knowledge is power. That's why they try to link everything they learn to a real-life meaning. Before starting a lesson, they ask themselves, how can I use this in the future? What problems can it solve? And then they try to connect the lesson to their real life. This way they have a reason to care about what they're learning. And you know what happens as a result? Their memory starts improving. For example, I know this one guy who studies 1 hour every single day. He doesn't do it to cram for a test or anything like that. He just wants to expand his general knowledge. That's why after dinner, he sits down, reads a book, and highlights interesting quotes. Even if he doesn't feel like it, he still does it anyway. He's now read hundreds of books and has a vast amount of knowledge just from consistently doing this one small habit. The secret is to keep it small enough that you can do it every day. Eventually, it becomes second nature and you don't have to think about it anymore. You don't even have to be correct 100% of the time. In fact, you might even teach the wrong things, but that's okay. The important thing is that you have to practice explaining it in your own words. That's what will cement it in your brain. In Japan, this happens all the time. Students gather together after class and discuss what they've just learned. They ask each other questions, quiz each other, explain difficult concepts, and so on. By doing this, they make sure that everyone understands the material. But then immediately after, they do a quick 1-minute review where they recall everything they've just learned. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, it shouldn't be. The purpose of this review is to activate the part of your brain responsible for memory. You see, our memories are like muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them. So instead of letting your hard-earned knowledge slip away, you periodically pull it back out and exercise with it. This way you won't forget nearly as much. See, our brains cannot function well when there's too much going on around us. We can only concentrate for 30 minutes to an hour before our minds wander off somewhere else. But if your environment is super distracting, this becomes much shorter. That's why Japanese students usually avoid distractions by keeping their study spaces clean and organized. They keep only the essentials there, nothing that could potentially distract them. And to achieve this state of calm, they might light up a candle, diffuse some essential oils, or play some lo-fi music. I've tried this myself and it really works. When I put on a podcast or music while I'm studying, my productivity drops significantly. But when I study in silence, my productivity skyrockets. Using these tools help Japanese students remember things way easier. Here's how it works. Let's say you're learning about World War II. There are thousands of them, and each one is made up of smaller parts called radicals. So memorizing kanji is a nightmare. That's why Japanese students spend years memorizing them. But even though it seems impossible, they've found ways to make it way easier. One of them is building stories. For example, this kanji is for mountain. The pronunciation is san, and the radical is this little tiny hill right here. Now we want to memorize this kanji, so we combine the two together by creating a story. Once upon a time, there was a small hill that was so lonely it wished it was a mountain. One day it started to rain and the small hill absorbed all the water vapor around it. It grew and grew until it became a huge mountain. That's the story. Now whenever you see this kanji, you'll remember the story of the sad lonely hill, which will help you remember the meaning and the pronunciation. I have used this method to remember tons of vocabulary, and I have even built an app that helps people memorize things faster. You can check it out below. This method works with absolutely anything. So if you have trouble memorizing names, places, equations, or anything else, try turning it into a story. Instead of just writing down the dates and events, try drawing a big timeline across your page and write down the dates there. Then draw little pictures or icons to represent each event and stick them on the timeline. It might seem silly at first, but our brains process images 60,000 times faster than text. So when you need to remember a lot of information, turn it into memorable images, symbols, colors, shapes, etc. Our brains love patterns, so the more associations you create, the more memorable the information becomes. Japanese schools usually give students a lot of homework, yet somehow they still manage to do it all. How? It's because they use the spaced repetition method. It's a technique where you review your lessons at increasing intervals. At first, you review it one day after you learn it, then 2 days later, then 5 days later, then 1 week later, then 1 month later, then 3 months later, and so on. You basically do this until you can remember it for several years. For example, let's say you finish learning chapter 1 of a book. Instead of putting it away and moving on to chapter 2, you keep it somewhere easily accessible and review it again 1 day later to make sure you still remember what is in it. Then you move on to chapter 2 and repeat the same process. When you finish it, you review chapter 1 again, but this time with chapter 2. Then you move on to chapter 3 and review all 3 chapters together. The next time you review it, add another chapter and so on. This is incredibly efficient because you only spend time reviewing things you need to remember. Japanese students apply this method to everything, from textbooks to extracurricular activities. So while they may seem like they're cramming all the time, they're really not. They've figured out how to get more done in less time by remembering things faster. Japanese students spend more time on active recall than passive reading. One of my professors during my master's degree was from Japan. He explained to me that when he was a student, he would spend hours in the library. He didn't go there to read more books, but rather to look through the books and find every single thing he had forgotten, because he wanted to understand why he'd forgotten it in the first place. For example, he would take a concept and try to recall how he learned it. What exactly is this concept? How does it relate to other concepts? Where did he learn it? And then he would go to the relevant pages to double-check his understanding and fill in the gaps. By doing this, he was able to save himself so much time in the long run and eventually graduated top of his class. This technique is known as active recall. It's a proven effective way to remember things better, because instead of just passively rereading your notes, you have to actively fish them out of your brain. You know the feeling when you reread your notes and think, yeah, I know this. But when you have to explain it or write a test on it, you suddenly forget most of it. That is because rereading your notes tricks your brain into thinking that you don't need to remember anything new. But when you practice active recall, you remind your brain that you need to remember this stuff. This is also why flashcards are an amazing tool for studying. Instead of just looking at the front of the flashcard, try to force yourself to remember the answer before looking at the back. Or even better, close your eyes while trying to remember the answer. When you do this consistently over time, your brain will start prioritizing this information, moving it from your short-term memory to your long-term memory. They use spaced repetition. There's this common myth that Japanese students study all day, every day. They use visual learning tools. Have you ever seen a Japanese student's notebook? They study in a minimalist environment. Most people assume that Japanese students study super hard at home, but that's not really true. They pace themselves using Pomodoro plus review. Japanese students make sure to pace themselves by forcing themselves to study in blocks of 25 minutes followed by 5 minutes of break. They memorize kanji using stories. Kanji are the building blocks of Japanese. They do group recall sessions. Group recall sessions are a great way to reinforce what you've learned. They study mindfully. Japanese students don't cram for weeks or months. They link learning to purpose. Many students complain that school is boring because there's no point to what they're learning. They have a healthy body and a sharp mind. The last factor is probably the most important one. Japanese students prioritize sleep, nutrition, and movement.